When I use the term codes of power, I'm foremost talking about the reality that culture informs everything that we do. And that most white people, because we live in a country where we see ourselves everywhere in every way, and our culture is validated everywhere and in every way, we don't understand how our cultural values are brought into the classroom. So when a white boy walks in the room, we understand him. We have similar cultural values. We understand how to behave, how to talk, how to respond to one another. If I'm a white woman and he's a white boy, he can see me as his mother. I can see him as my child. That positions him to know not only that he's right in the world, but that he deserves to feel comfortable and that he is really claiming his rightful place in the world to be a leader. A white boy who walks in the room and is animated and moving around and maybe even a little cheeky is smart. And isn't he smart? Isn't he cheeky? He's almost looked at as, well, boys will be boys. A boy of color, especially an African-American boy who walks in the room exhibiting the same behavior, walks in and says, I might need to keep an eye on him. And that, I really believe, is our internalized racism, that we are afraid of these young boys. And I'm talking young boys, 4 years old and above. And that instead of the teacher looking at him or herself and saying, what is going on with me? That this same behavior creates fear in me instead of admiration. We pathologize the boy of color.
This is the story of Bruce Jones, who walked in a shadow of hate and suspicion. The shadow of what he was because of his background. This is also the story of the people who knew Bruce, or thought they did.
I don't know why they let people like him go to our school anyway. And I'm not the only one. My folks don't like it a bit.
Boy, my dad made it plain I wasn't to associate with him.
How are you going to keep from doing it? Sitting in the same classrooms association, isn't it?
That's what I say. There ought to be some way to avoid it.
But I can't understand. It's why he'd want to be with us. Wouldn't he be doing himself a big favor to quit and get a job?
Nah, who'd hire a guy like him?
The main reason why I became an AP English teacher is, for myself, I remember when I was in high school, I never had an African-American male teacher. Actually, even in college for my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, and currently as I'm pursuing a doctoral degree, I've never had an African-American male teacher. For myself, I think that my presence makes a big precedence for my students and also for other students who do not get to encounter an African-American male and see them in a different role other than what you see in entertainment, what you see on television. But I know for me, I'm an individual who will make a lasting imprint on many of my students because I'm an African-American male who does not fit the stereotype.
I was born in Medford, Oregon, and in Medford there were absolutely no people of color within the city limits. So we're 11 years old and I meet another person who then becomes my best friend, and she still is my best friend. And her name was Serena Maria Cruz, right? So Serena, for me, wasn't of color. She was white. So we're graduating, we're signing up for the PSAT to take the test, and this is where we've gone to school together for 5 or 6 years, and we've been to each other's houses, we've had birthday parties, we're all involved in the same gifted program activities, and she's filling out her form and filling out her race. And I'm filling out my form, and I look over at Serena and I see her filling out the bubble for Hispanic. And so I actually reach out and I grab her hand and I pull it up and I tell her, Serena, you're supposed to fill out the white bubble. And she looks at me and she says, look at me, Susie. She says, look at me, like this. And I looked at her and I didn't have any clue what she was talking about. I didn't know what she was talking about. And when I look back now, right, and I think about entitlement, I I mean, it's hard for me to even locate where racial entitlement is because everything about my life has been entitlement.
I'm a teacher working at a rural elementary school that consists of only Aboriginal students in British Columbia. I see a cycle perpetuating as my students go through the school system. As my students go onward to high schools with students of all different backgrounds, they find themselves marginalized and they encounter racism, discrimination, and bullying. The Aboriginal students are subjugated to extremely racist name-calling. They are being called resdrig, which is an extremely degrading and racist term. These experiences perpetuate low self-esteem, low self-concept, and creates a school culture of hostility and insecurity. One of the responses to this situation has been to bring the non-Aboriginal students on a field trip to the rural elementary school that the Aboriginal students attend. The rationale is that this exposure to the Aboriginal school will deflate myths that these students come from schools and communities that are dirty and undeserving of respect. This response echoes a museum approach, examining culture as though it were a static artifact to study through glass. Many Aboriginal students are dropping out of school, turning to drugs, and even committing suicide. Low academic achievement also contributes to the cycle of alienation for Aboriginal youth. Insufficient resources, lack of role models, and lack of parental involvement also contribute to this problem. As a teacher, I thought, what can I do to foster change? How can education empower my students? How can education prevent bullying and racism? I want to promote and adopt a multicultural anti-racist pedagogy. The ideology behind multicultural education addresses the most important objectives that I want for my students and for the students who they will encounter at high school. The objectives include supporting students in the development of a positive self-esteem and identity. I want to validate student identity and self-concept. Supporting self-determination. It is imperative to support student autonomy, sense of belonging, and sense of competence. This will validate students and increase motivation. I also want to enlarge the third space, which refers to the space where cultures meet and overlap harmoniously and find unity in diversity. All curriculum should respond to these needs and meet these objectives. In practice, curriculum must address content in such a way that is historically rooted, that examines identity and privilege, that explores identity in relation to history and social issues, that includes past human rights violations, that urges students to recognize and question social constructions of difference, that exposes them to different forms of resistance used by different groups to liberate themselves from oppression. These are all important factors as they expose the relationship between power and knowledge, which will empower students. This is the vision I am deciding to enact. It may not solve all the problems right away, but it is a start towards furthering a more inclusive school environment that embraces differences.
It's about racism, but she can't get away from the fact that God created the races, and you are going to be different. You can't help it.
God
to be like that.
One race, the human race, and human beings created racism.
Prior to about 1670 or so, there was no such thing as the white race, at least not recognized as such, called as such. That is not what people of European descent were when they were in Europe. They were English, they were Irish, they were Scottish, they were whatever they were. They were not white. Only in the colonies do we become white, and for a very specific reason, because in those early years of the colonial period, where you had white indentured servants, one level above enslaved themselves, and you had African-descended folks, some of them enslaved for life, others indentured servants also in the earliest years of the colonies. Those people would often see their interests as being common. They all...
The Europeans have exploited their natural resources, leaving a continent where there are few fish in their rivers and less timber in their forests. Their towns are crowded with people, and they don't know what to do with them. One has the vision to sail west to arrive in the east. He is a seaman from Genoa, Italy, a fervent amateur who has the crazy idea of sailing into the unknown to reach India. Success will mean glory and riches for himself and the Spanish monarchy.
It turns out there may be evidence that Zheng He made it to America even earlier than 1421.
As we know from records in China, he was sent across the world to the Americas, to Africa, everywhere.
Miles. Roughly the distance from the port in Nanjing to the Americas and back. Author Gavin Menzies believes there is proof of the voyage just off Bimini Island in the Bahamas.
Somebody was there a hell of a long time ago and built this road, and I say it was a breakwater. I was certain that we would find one day the master map of the world, the Chinese map, and here it is. It showed the whole world, as you can see, accurately. This map was produced as a result of the voyages of Zheng He, his voyages to the barbarians.
Three Spanish ships sail west for 3 months in search of India. Then finally they arrive, 87 men, among them conquistadors, pig farmers, murderers. But this is not Asia. It is an island in the Caribbean. They have no idea that they have come to a new world. They will both soon discover that this is just the beginning.
Smallpox was accidentally introduced to the Americas in the 16th century. The smallpox virus is very hardy. In blankets that are used by smallpox victims, the scabs can live for weeks carrying the virus. And smallpox can also pass from host to host on board a transatlantic vessel until it reaches the Americas. And of course, once smallpox reached the Americas, it was introduced to millions of new hosts, human hosts, who had no acquired immunities to these diseases. And so smallpox, together with measles and influenza, had a devastating impact on Native American populations. No one knows exactly what the mortality was. Conservative estimates are about 50%. It was probably closer to 90% or even higher.
Europeans fitted themselves into existing trading patterns along the African coast, and then gradually, as the slave trade became more important, came to dominate the slave trade as a whole.
Human existence.
After 1620, when indentured servitude was changed into the permanent state of slavery, permanent state of the institution of slavery, the Virginia colonists passed a series of laws that are called the slave codes. And these slave codes are codified into law to restrict and prohibit enslaved people from having access to government, from having access to private enterprise, as well as prohibiting enslaved people from having relationship between wife to husband, husband to children, and subsequently the ownership of property. It's complete prohibition in every phase of life to control and maintain enslaved people as property of slave owners.
This is the worst, the dirtiest secret in African American history is that a surprisingly high percentage of the free Negroes in the South owned slaves themselves. And some of them owned, we explain it away by saying, oh, but they only own their mother, or they only own, yeah, they own their mother, they own their sister, they own their wife, and they own some other workers too. A surprisingly high number owned workers who they did not liberate.
Of Columbia, nation's capital, was carved out of land from Maryland and Virginia, so too were its slave laws. But by the early to mid-1800s, with the number of free blacks growing in the district and the anti-slavery movement picking up steam, the climate in our nation's capital began to change.
We, as the human race, should never suppress, never enslave, never oppress, and never treat our fellow humans indifferent. The lesson from this is that freedom, liberation, equality, and justice should be for all, and oppression and slavery for none.
In a speech yesterday, the Vice President of the United States denounced deserters, radicals, Black Panthers, and others, as he delicately put it, who were zoo occupants. Mr. Spiro Agnew talks as though he thought of himself as Prime Minister of fascist Greece. The Vice President of the United States is a prevaricating panderer of a putrid politics. And it is exactly we zoo inhabitants who are assuring the end of his power and the power of the social assassins he represents.
President Spiro Agnew resigned today, the first man holding his high office to do so under fire. Agnew then pleaded no contest, in effect guilty, to income tax evasion. The court placed him on probation for 3 years and imposed a maximum fine of $10,000. Howard?
While I'm fully aware that the plea of nolo contendere was the equivalent of a plea of guilty for the purpose of that negotiated proceeding in Baltimore, it does not represent a confession of any guilt whatever for any other purpose. I made the plea because it was the only way to quickly resolve the situation.
Marxism knows and emphasizes that its goals are common to those held by the partisans of the Enlightenment and upholders of all the great religions. Were Marxists alone in this dedication, they would persevere, but they would fail. They are not alone, however, and all who stand together opposed to systematized exploitation and systematic extermination will, exactly because they stand together.
For a long time, I felt that the fundamental error of the civil rights movement was its failure to include class or economics as a viable, salient category of analysis. The leaders of the race were afraid that once we, in large numbers, relatively large numbers, got into these power centers, that we would never come home. But running simultaneously, as you well know, was the belief that the larger group could drag you down, that you needed to go to these historically white schools, become a member of the black elite, a new black elite, a black elite as defined, as my mother, God rest her soul, would say, by white money and white access as opposed to colored money.
Many of you know about the historic civil rights movement, the struggle of brave women and men of uncommon courage who fought against the structure of racialized inequality known as Jim Crow segregation. Many of you know and have seen the photographs, the black and white films of the demonstrations in the nation's capital and across this country challenging Jim Crow. Restaurants, restrooms, schools, buses. For a century in this country, despite the passage of laws, despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution that followed the Civil War, the fundamental conflict in American history, people of African descent were still defined as second-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The civil rights struggle was a struggle that defined an entire generation of people of conscience in this country.
I come to think of myself as a white privileged person, and how do I help other white privileged people acknowledge it and become conscious of it? And not in a guilt-producing way, but in a way that really helps them see that they're part of a system that teaches them to be this way. And how do you overcome this kind of teaching, whether it's becoming a more humble person, but I would say it's becoming a more active person, a person who can convey some of those messages to other people, and that it's not wrong to be a white privileged woman, because that's what I am and I'm here. But it conveys a responsibility.
Well, you better find your voice, accent your individuality in community so you can contribute to the high quality of the collective performance. John Coltrane, quit imitating Johnny Hodges. Imitation is suicide. Find your voice. Each citizen, dig deep into the precincts of your own soul and examine the suburbs of your heart and find your voice and get it out. Not just your self-interest, but your voice that balances enlightened self-interest with public interest and common good.
Frank Rich, who, again, is a fairly liberal columnist and wrote a piece, I think it was in the New York Times, right after or right before the election, where he said that, you know, basically racism is not a problem anymore because when white folks get to know black folks well, their biases and their fears subside. Now, number one, I'm not sure that's true. But secondly, even if it were true, the truth is, given the history of racism, spatial segregation, residential isolation, the fact that 85% of white folks live in communities with virtually no people of color around, even if he were right, it wouldn't matter because most white folks won't get that opportunity to actually form close, intimate friendships or connections with people of color. And unfortunately, if it isn't happening, the only way we get to know folks of color is via media. So maybe we see Barack Obama on television coming into our living rooms every night. And over an 18-month to 2-year period, we're able to say, yeah, you know, I sort of like that guy. He seems really capable and really bright. Maybe I wasn't sure at first, but given 2 years, he was able to overcome, you know, maybe my first impression. But the only other folks we're seeing in the media are either folks who are sort of superstars on the one hand or criminals on the other hand. Those are the black folks we typically see on TV. They're either like mega millionaire athletes or entertainers, or they're the folks doing a perp walk on the 6 o'clock news that the cops have just gone arrested and haven't even let them put a shirt on before cuffing them and bringing them out in front of the cameras. If the only people you see regularly are superstar millionaires and thugs, for the average person, they can't relate to either of those, right? The average person of color can't, and the average white person can't either. The superstar, you're likely to envy their position, and the thug you're afraid of. And envy and fear are not particularly good human emotions upon which to base some personal connections or intimate relationships. So I think that's what we're dealing with. You know, Barack Obama or Bill Cosby or Oprah Winfrey or a handful of people of color, we're able to get to know them, or at least we think we know them, via media. But for average everyday white folks and for average everyday black and brown folks, the ability to really get to know each other and overcome those implicit biases is a lot more rare.